It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Smallbone, Director of the Griffith Youth Forensic Service at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, Griffith University. Stephen Smallbone is a psychologist. He's a professor in the School of Criminology, and as I said, he's Director of the Youth Forensic Service. He's also an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. His current research includes empirical investigations of the development, onset and progression of youth and adult sexual offending, developing and testing an ecological field-based intervention model for adjudicated youth sexual offenders, and the implementation and evaluation of place-based strategies for preventing sexual violence and abuse. He's widely published. He's the incoming editor from 2014 of the Journal of Sexual Aggression, and today he's going to present on the topic of situational prevention of sexual abuse. Please welcome Stephen Smallbone.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and thank you all. This is an area that I've been interested in for some time. My interest really came from a collaboration with my friend and colleague Richard Wortley, who was a colleague at Griffith and now is the Director of the Department of Security and Crime Science at University College London. Our collaboration, we both agree, I think, has been a really very productive one. I knew nothing really about situational crime prevention. When I met Richard, he had in turn kind of really no interest in sex offending at all, even though both of us had been prison psychologists in the past. So this is very much a kind of a meeting of minds of sorts, I suppose. And I'm really pleased to see that the ideas seem to have struck something of a chord. It's a new area in the sense that situational crime prevention has historically been applied to property crimes. Really, that's where the evidence base is for the effectiveness of situational prevention. There isn't as yet an evidence base to speak of for the effectiveness of situational prevention to prevent sexual abuse. So I'm not able to persuade you by evidence today. I'm hoping to persuade you at least partly by logic. And so I'm going to present some concepts about what situational prevention is. And then I thought the most sensible thing to do to try and illustrate how these concepts might be applied, because I suspect that's the real question that people might have here. I'm going to present a very brief case study, and this involved my engagement of a small piece of work really, but my involvement at the invitation of some lawyers acting on behalf of a private school in Australia which had some arrests of staff for sex offences, and I'll get to that shortly. This is my opening gambit, and I'm kind of expecting maybe that your suspicion meters might go off straight away. Mine do whenever I hear people talk about always of anything, and I've underlined that just to kind of push the point. But I think this is one of these rare exceptions, for me at least, where I can accept that this is such a fundamental principle of human behaviour that we can make the bold statement that sexual abuse, like other kinds of social behaviour particularly, always occurs as a result of proximal person-situation interactions. I have an evolutionary psychologist colleague at Griffith who, when I was discussing a case with him one day, and he said, you know, that was caused by the Big Bang. And he's right, of course. This kind of problem of attributing causes is an interesting one, isn't it? Because really the Big Bang causes sexual abuse through an incredibly complex chain of cause and effect relationships. But while that's true, it's unhelpful, of course, isn't it? And the point I'm making here is that the most useful causal explanations are about the near causes of behaviour, I think. And while any person here who has studied psychology or has read a first-year psychology textbook, probably in the first chapter of that textbook you will have been told that human behaviour is a function of the interaction between the characteristics of the person and the characteristics of the immediate situation in which the action occurs. It's a fundamental principle of psychology. But a lot of psychologists seem to kind of learn that for long enough to pass the test, and then will often forget it in practice and become really fascinated by the internal psychology of people and come to the view that the explanation for behaviour, and particularly morally problematic behaviour, really has to be about who the person is. But this principle tells us that that's at best only ever half of the story. The other half of the story is to be told in the context in which that action occurs. So we need to know something about both sides of that equation. We need to know something about the person or the individual contribution to the behaviour, I guess, before we can think about how we can understand the situation. Because ultimately, it's not really two things that we're dealing with. It's one. It's the interaction. That's the point, I think, at which we need to understand the problem. How do these individual characteristics interact with the situation, and what are the situational properties that are involved in that interaction? So let's start anyway with the one side of the equation. What do we know about sexual abusers? Well, just rather than go into the psychological characteristics, I'm going to be a little bit more basic about this. Firstly, we know that sexual abusers are almost always male, and this comes not just from official data. It's not just a reporting bias. It also is shown in victimisation surveys. So around 95%, males are overrepresented in virtually all sorts of crime, but nowhere to the extent that they're overrepresented in sexual crime. I would say that there is no other defining demographic or psychological characteristic. And this is despite enormous efforts to try and find psychological characteristics of sexual offenders. There's almost a preoccupation. There's certainly a dominance of clinical approaches in the literature about sexual offending and sexual offenders that is continually searching for something about them that must explain the problem behaviour. But for all of that effort, it's come to really not very much. I think it's safe to conclude that there is no particular defining characteristic. Going back to my conversations with my colleague Richard Wortley, he would often say to me, from his experience in the prisons, that he was struck by the ordinariness of people, not by their psychopathology or unusual characteristics, but by their ordinariness. And I think this is part of the story about sexual abuse, with some exceptions. And I think that's illustrated in people's reactions when they discover that somebody has been doing this. They often think, shocked, how could this possibly be? This seemed like an ordinary person. And if we're keen to kind of pursue our biases toward the psychopathology explanations, then we'll be joining dots backwards, and we'll find some evidence probably that we can connect up to prove to ourselves that they must have been monsters after all, the whole time. I think that it's important, and I think this, certainly the weight of evidence suggests very clearly to me that there are two main onset risk periods for abusers. And this is unlike other kinds of crime. One of the most accepted aspects of crime in general is the so-called age crime curve. We know that for almost all other kinds of crime, individuals' involvement in crime peaks in adolescence and early adulthood and then declines quite sharply thereafter. That curve, if we just plotted adolescent sex offenders, that curve would look very similar. An uptake of involvement in adolescence and then a decline, a sharp and steady decline from early adulthood. But the majority of abusers, at least as far as we're aware, are in fact adults. And that curve, their involvement, is really quite different from this. There's a second peak, if you like, to that curve, which seems to occur in early middle age. The onset ages range, and one of the important things I think about, thinking about when does the first incident occur, this has become a bit of a preoccupation for me over the last few years. I'm very interested to know as much as we can about that first incident. this is ignored in the clinical literature because the clinical literature tends to be concerned with the offender's presentation now and the implications of that for the future. But I think we need to know how it starts because that's the offence that we most would like to prevent. It's the most important one to prevent. Things get messy afterwards. Once the offences happen, as many people here will know, the situation becomes very, very difficult. So adolescents, these are young people under the age of 18, are responsible for a substantial proportion of sexual abuse. This is the abuse of children under the age of 16, around 30 to 40%. Abusers very typically know the victim before the first abuse incident. And some of the work that we've done on several hundred adult sexual offenders whose victims were children, almost 2/3 of those people told us that they had known the victim for more than 12 months before the first abuse incident had occurred. Stranger offending is very rare, as I'm sure we'd know, but it's particularly problematic because it may involve abduction and desperate efforts. It's a desperate behaviour, it seems to me. It's really the worst nightmare, isn't it? The child being taken from the front yard or from a shopping centre or something like that. And so, there can be a murder involved in that, probably as a desperate effort by the offender to escape detection. We also know that child sexual abuse offending is often part of a broader pattern of socially irresponsible and unlawful conduct. So the evidence is consistently pointing to the fact that adult sex offenders are about twice as likely to be rearrested for a non-sexual offence as they are for a new sex offence. And in fact, they're also twice as likely to have a previous conviction for a non-sex offence as they are to have a previous conviction for a sex offence. We look at adolescents, that level of criminal versatility, if you like, is even more striking. So adolescent sex offenders are 8 to 10 times more likely to be rearrested for a non-sex offence in the future as they are a sex offence. Which, by the way, suggests perhaps for many abusers that the problem behaviour isn't so much one of specific interest in or a specific problem connected to sexual deviance, but perhaps a broader problem to do with rule breaking, a disregard of other people's rights, the willingness to exploit vulnerable people and so on. This is why I think that sexual abuse is best understood as a crime. Now that's a kind of a biased view. I work in a criminology department. The thinking is around crime, but I think that sexual abuse ought to be understood as a crime because it has the features of crime. If there are any psychiatrists here, I would say that DSM has got it wrong, and it's had it wrong for maybe 150 years since Kraft-Ebing started talking about pedophilia as part of the same logical set as liking to dress up as a woman or being interested sexually in shoes, for example. I don't think it's like that. I think it's much more like theft and armed robbery, actually, than it is strange sexual deviations. Now, there are all sorts of ways there's so much variation in this population of abusers that there needs to be some way of reducing the complexity or reducing the heterogeneity of this population. And there have been a lot of efforts to try and create typologies. I'm going to suggest a hypothetical typology to you that has a particular purpose to it. And I'm usually disinclined to use the word predatory because I think there's so much baggage that goes with that. I'm using that in a purely descriptive kind of way, and I'm not meaning to imply anything really more than a description of behaviour that's perhaps characterised by a level of persistence in the motivations and behaviour, a kind of a calculating way of dealing with their environments. These types of offenders tend to have an unambiguous sexual interest in children. They're prepared to invest a lot of effort to obtain these sexual contacts, but only if necessary. This is one of truisms really about crime is that crime tends to be a low effort kind of behaviour. Crime for some people just is an easier option than a legitimate way of getting the same outcome. And may become adept at creating opportunities and avoiding detection. This fits with the stereotype, I think, the construction of the sex offender that certainly looms large in the public mind, and that I think drives a lot of the policy responses as well. And it helps perhaps our need to regard these people as simply different from us, a kind of a class of people, if you like. And I'm not sure even that people who have these kinds of characteristics as abusers start out that way. I really wonder whether a lot of this is a product of the offending itself, that as people persist in their offending, they become more and more involved in the offending and perhaps become more and more marginalised as a result of it. Another kind of interesting observation about crime is that crime very often starts with a small incident, and then the offender kind of digs themselves deeper into trouble. And a lot of that trouble comes from efforts to avoid detection. Once you've committed a crime, you have a range of problems to deal with that you might not have before you began that crime. And the crime itself unfolds, of course, as well. So what a person intends to do when they begin the process of committing a crime isn't necessarily what it looks like in terms of the outcome. And this is very instructive, I think, when we're thinking about sexual abuse, because we're, I would say, as a group of people here, particularly sensitive to the outcomes for children of sexual abuse. But I can count probably on one hand, if I can think of very, very few examples, if any, of any adult sex offenders or adolescent sex offenders that I met who offended in order to create those consequences for those children. That's not why they do it. It's an outcome. And we need to be careful that we don't make assumptions by observing the outcomes of crime, including sexual abuse, as though that has relevance for understanding the motivation of the offender in the first place. A lot of offenders go to great lengths to ignore, in fact, the outcomes for the victims. The second group, if you like, in this hypothetical typology is the opportunistic offender. These are people who would generally have conventional social values, including probably ideas that people shouldn't sexually abuse children, but may have weak constraints. They may have not very well-developed self-control in a range of circumstances, and they may also be not very sensitive to the influence of social controls. They're likely to engage in various minor offences, and we often see with both adolescent but particularly adult sex offenders a history of low-level non-sex offending that paints a picture of opportunism, of being prepared to be fraudulent if an opportunity presents itself, or be prepared to steal something if they come across an opportunity to do that. So this is their relationship with crime, really. It's an ambivalent relationship, really. We'll take the opportunities as they fortuitously occur, but they're unlikely to invest a great deal of effort in creating the circumstances or the opportunities to commit crimes. And with respect to their sexual interest in children, I would describe that as ambivalent. Even perhaps they may have strong ideas that this oughtn't happen, but when it does happen for them, it becomes an exception, of course, in their circumstance. And finally, a group that I would call situational offenders. Again, a group of people with perhaps conventional social values, usually adequate self-control, very sensitive to informal social controls. These are really people like you and me, perhaps. But succumb to the temptation in a very specific set of circumstances. And I'll describe a little bit about that a little bit later on. The issue here again is that whatever the intention may have been to commit the first illegal act, and in this case again, a sexual abuse of a child, they're likely to become entrapped by that. And I'm not putting that to you to invoke your sympathy for them. It's just as a matter of fact that they're likely, partly because of their perhaps social standing, their sensitivity to the relationships that are important to them, really are very likely to want to cover over the incident, to not have anybody else know about it. And of course, once you start to take efforts to avoid detection, part of what you're likely to do is to engage with the child in that effort to avoid detection. And so there's all sorts of conversations that might be had with the child. If you tell anybody I'm going to go to jail, a dreadful thing for a little kid to bear some responsibility for. And lies and deceit, even if it wasn't necessarily part of their character to be deceitful in a general sense, here is a circumstance that would cause them really to want to be deceitful, to protect themselves. So that's a little bit of a broad brush analysis perhaps of one side of this person, situation, interaction equation. What do we know about sexual abuse situations themselves? Forgive me, I'm really aware that there's a lot of sensitivity about words in this kind of area, and I'm hoping I'm not giving offence to anybody. I'm just being pragmatic. But the victim is very much a part of the situation, of course. There are other aspects to that situation, but one of the most important ones, the most important one perhaps, is the victim. So what do we know about victims to begin with? We know that girls are about twice at risk of being sexually abused, as are boys, and we also know that girls and boys tend to be abused in different ways and in different settings. So girls are more likely to be abused repeatedly over longer periods and in familial settings and at a younger age, by and large. But for boys, their experience of sexual abuse tends to be that they're abused less often, over shorter periods, in non-familial settings and at an older age. There are exceptions, there's a lot of overlap. These are just generalisations I'm making here. The corollary, of course, to the offender knowing the victim, well, obviously the victim knows the offender, often for long periods before the abuse. We know that there are a range of vulnerabilities that increase the risk for children to be abused. We also know that children, just by virtue of their age and dependent relationships on adults, are all somewhat at risk. But that's notwithstanding the evidence that there are these particular kinds of vulnerabilities that increase the risk for particular children. And this same cluster of vulnerabilities operates in two ways. Firstly, they increase the risk of being abused in the first place. But then if abuse does occur, the same kinds of vulnerabilities tend to compound the outcomes. They're associated with increased negative outcomes following the abuse. We also know that the outcomes for children aren't just to do with the abuse incident, that they can often be related to things that have occurred before the abuse incident and after the abuse incident as well, particularly the way that others react. I mean, we're talking largely psychological effects for children. It's, in some circumstances, clearly there are physical effects as well, but the big set of problems tends to be a range of psychological effects for children. And they're going to be looking to others, to particularly adults and particularly significant adults, for information about how adults think they ought to react. It's an interesting lesson, isn't it, for us, in the sense that we all have some responsibility for this in the end. We also know, and Justice McClellan pointed it out, that sexual abuse often occurs in the context of other kinds of abuse as well. There's quite a considerable coincidence of emotional, physical and sexual abuse and neglect. And we also know that children who are abused are significantly increased risk of being abused again, but curiously, not just in the same set of circumstances, but in apparently unrelated circumstances later in their life. This most of the research about this has been with respect to girls. I think we know less about it for boys, but particularly for girls who are abused, we know that some studies point to alarming incidents of other kinds of abuse as an adult, years and years after the original abuse may have occurred as a child. The other major feature of the abuse situation is the setting in which it occurs. So what do we know about this? We know that domestic or familial settings are the places where sexual abuse tends to be the most prevalent. In some of the work that we did with adult child sexual abusers, 70% of those abusers told us, and these are both familial and non-familial abusers, told us that the first incident occurred in the victim's home. The second type of setting is an organisational setting. And I think that there are interesting analogies to the kinds of organisational settings where sexual abuse tends to occur to the circumstances where abuse occurs in family settings. And this really helps us, I think, to define the kinds of organisations that are likely to be at greatest risk to children. They're places where older males tend to be in these roles of authority and caretaking, very sort of a quasi-parental role, really. And that the role often involves some kind of physical contact as part of the routine of the role, to do with playing with children or bathing or dressing or so on, or a level of emotional intimacy, so engaging children in conversation or in ways that arouses a level of emotional connection from the child to the adult and from the adult to the child. And I think it's also important when we're thinking about organisational abuse to recognise that abuse can be related to the contact of children and adults within an organisational setting. But the abuse itself may well occur away from the organisational setting. Again, quite a number of abusers who have engaged with the child in an organisational setting have abused the child actually in the child's home or in the abuser's home. The third main type of setting is the public setting, and here we're dealing with a needle in a haystack problem, really. I mean, if we aren't already dealing with a needle in a haystack problem when we're trying to think about the kinds of organisations where abuse might occur, certainly if we're thinking about abuse in public settings, it's very problematic. But as I mentioned before, there's a particular reason to be concerned about this because of the level of dangerousness that may be involved. I want to make another point about this. We've looked at some data involving about 300 or so adult sexual abusers and a similar number of adolescent sexual abusers. We operate a program for young people who are in trouble in the courts for sex offences, and we're using our clinical data. And we've done some comparisons and discovered that the prevalence of abuse across these settings is significantly different for those two groups. Adolescents, most of the adolescents commit sexual abuse offences within homes as well, but they're more likely than adult offenders to abuse in organisational and in public settings. And we think the reason is simply because adolescents have less control over domestic spaces than adults do. That adolescents tend to spend more time in other kinds of places, and particularly in public places like parks, for example, are more likely to kind of hang out with their friends there because they can, create a space that they see as their own, where they can't do that within a home setting necessarily. Now, there is now, of course, a fourth type of setting, the so-called virtual setting, but without suggesting that this is less problematic or non-problematic, I'm not certainly saying that. But despite our attention to this, really, it's still true that the official prevalence is still comparatively low. Look at these data from the US. Now, this is not current data. Finkelhor and his group have been doing these nationwide surveys in the US. And the last report that I've seen anyway is in 2006. They're due to report again on the state of play in, I think, 2011 or 2012. I haven't seen that report. But if we look at 2006 anyway, they estimated 3,672 arrests US-wide for online sex offenders. But look what else is going on in the US. More than 600 in the same year. more than 600,000 violent offences that year, including more than 92,000 forcible rapes. So there's still plenty going on, I guess is the story, in the real world, that maybe our attention to the virtual problem should be kept in some perspective here. So let me introduce you then, if you're not already familiar with some concepts that criminological concepts that try and help us to understand the role of situations in crime generally. And as we work through these, I just wanted to ask you to think about the extent to which you think these can apply to understanding sexual abuse. We'll start with the rational choice approach. Ron Clark is probably the key figure in the area of situational crime prevention around the world. These models and the whole set of methods and concepts around situational crime prevention came from his work in the Home Office in England back in the late 70s and early 1980s. And Ron Clark's kind of famous for talking about good enough theorising. He's just not interested in theory except for the simplest possible level of explanation that allows productive and useful things to happen by way of preventing crime. Some people have described the criminological theory as, more broadly, as sinking under the weight of its own theorising, just being preoccupied with increasing levels of complexity. Well, Ron would say, bar humbug, you don't need any of that. All you need is enough of an explanation to get us moving forward to doing useful things. So this is very much a reductionist kind of argument, I guess. But essentially, rational choice, he doesn't call it a theory, is the point. That's why I'm calling it a rational choice approach. Casts offenders as rational decision makers. That he says we don't need a special explanation for criminal motivations. They're ordinary motivations. It's really what needs to be explained is why it is that people take illegitimate paths in order to obtain these kinds of goals. So the kinds of goals that motivates crime are these ordinary goals. For money, we all want money, we all want status, excitement and so on, sexual gratification. Here lies, I expect, a conceptual barrier for you, the idea of how could anybody see a child in sexual terms? And it becomes a harder and harder thing to reconcile the younger and younger the child is, of course. But then there are extremes to all sorts of crime as well. So I'm not sure that necessarily disqualifies this explanation. Just by the way, are people aware that I think it was the mid-19th century in England, it was legal to have sex with a 10-year-old girl? That the age of consent was raised really largely by the efforts of social reformers that were concerned primarily at that time about the rampant child prostitution in London, Victorian London. So it was raised to 12 and then to 14 and then ultimately to 16, which is where we are now. So it's not really all that long ago where what we're dealing with now is very much a new modern conception of childhood and the need to protect children from being exploited in a range of ways. And I'm absolutely not suggesting that in any way to excuse or to, I'm the first in line to defend our laws to do with protection of children. But we do have to get out of our own kind of, I think, personal view of the world, I think, to appreciate this, that there is, in fact, and it's not a happy message to send, is it? I mean, really what this suggests is that the potential to sexually abuse children is much, much wider than most people would like to think, that it is not a problem that can simply be contained to this idea of a deviant subclass of people that we might call pedophiles. That's, I think, the lesson here. The good story, of course, is that very, very few people actually do it. and there are good reasons why that happens as well. Anyway, so when we think about criminal behaviour, perhaps including sexual abuse as involving a process of rational decision-making, rational choice, the perspective reminds us that they're not talking about full and free rationality. They're talking about what they call bounded rationality. The fact is, when a potential offender is faced with a criminal opportunity, they may well be in a situation where the decision-making is constrained by the limited information available to them, the limited time they have to weigh up their options about whether they're going to get caught or not, or whether this is worth doing or not. And of course, they're subjected, as we all are, to their own limitations with respect to their cognitive biases and other kinds of limitations. They might not be that smart, for example. So in these circumstances, the criminal option is more likely to be taken, all other things being equal, when firstly the perceived risk of detection is low. And the perception is the important thing. It's not the actual risk that counts, it's the perception of the offender of that risk that counts. So in a sense, this is, it's probably more important by way of an intervention to have the effect of increasing the perception of risk among people than it is even increasing the actual risk of detection. Secondly, the criminal option is more likely to be taken when it requires less effort than legitimate options, and when it promises a highly desired reward. A second type of theory or conceptual framework focusing on the role of situations in crime is the so-called routine activities theory. And this reminds us that crime generally occurs in the normal course of routine activities of offenders and victims. This relates a little bit to the effort principle in rational choice. Offenders, by and large, don't go to great lengths in order to commit crimes, but they're certainly ready to take advantage of circumstances as they present themselves. This is probably why we see the problem of sexual abuse in organisational settings and in domestic settings. This is where adult males, in particular, or older males, are in routine contact with children in particular kinds of ways, as I was suggesting before, to do with physical closeness and emotional closeness to children. Cohen and Felsen argue that we can break down into this very simple equation the basic chemistry of crime. You need three elements for any crime to occur. Firstly, you need a motivated offender. Secondly, you need a suitable target. This is their language. So for us, this is really about perhaps a vulnerable child. Importantly, in the absence of a capable guardian. Crime won't occur if there's a capable guardian there. Capable being the operative word. Somebody who, by definition, can act to prevent that from happening. This also reminds us that crime generally is prevented not by police. Police are the backup for us. They deal with the failures, our failures, to prevent crime in the normal course of our day-to-day life. So it's our actions as guardians, as handlers. This is a technical term in routine activities theory to refer to a person who has a capacity and responsibility to influence the behaviour of a potential offender. The term guardian is usually used for a person with the same role with respect to a potential victim. But don't forget that many of these offences are occurring by young people, and even when they're involving older people as offenders, there are people who know those people as well who may have an influence over the way that they behave, whether they're family members or in organisations, co-workers. As well as bystanders. In fact, bystanders can create as much crime as they can solve, by egging on fights and so on, and pushing people, encouraging people to behave badly. And place managers. So there's usually, and this is again relevant to organisations, there are usually people within organisations whose role it is to control the behaviour of the people within that organisational setting. In a shopping centre, it would be security guards. In a school, it would be a head teacher and perhaps some of the other senior staff, etc. Now, both rational choice theory and routine activities theory, because of them wanting to have uncomplicated theoretical principles, really have the motivated offender as the default option. So routine activities theory and rational choice theory simply assume that there are motivated offenders around. And so the way to deal with situations is to block opportunities and so on. It's very much an opportunity reduction model. This idea of crime precipitators, though, adds something, I think, important, and it brings the problem back to the original equation of the interaction between the person and the situation. Not just the person acting on the situation, but also the situation acting on the person. We can easily demonstrate that here. Probably none of us have thought up until right now, and I remind you, that there are very powerful but subtle cues operating right here in the room that are affecting our behaviour. And I reckon there's probably enough people in the room here who probably from time to time like to have a good dance, for example. But I would put money on the fact that we won't see any dancing in the next half hour in the room. So that can't be explained on the basis that there's a low disposition in the room for dancing. It's explained on the basis of the power of the situation that we're in that's affecting our behaviour. So perhaps situations then can, in a dynamic and active way, influence criminal motivations. And this is Richard Wertley, who did some of the foundation work here in the late 90s and early 2000s. So his argument is that social situations contain dynamic properties that can present cues that prompt a criminal response. They can exert social pressure. Certainly in some of our work with our adolescent offenders, we've had a few occasions where there have been groups of young people involved in a sex offence, and our assessment has revealed quite a range of motivations among those kids. You know, some of them probably wouldn't have done that if it hadn't been for the particular peer circumstance that they found themselves in at that time. You know, going along with somebody else's bad idea, really. Situations can weaken moral restraints and so permit a criminal response. We heard the horrendous story about the boy in the Catholic organisation in WA, where there'd been almost like a conspiracy of action, groups of people creating an environmental culture where it became permissible. It's still a mystery to me how an organisation, a church organisation in particular, can arrange itself so that it places the value on its own, on itself, higher than the value of protecting children, but that's what happens. And part of the way that happens is through the development of certain kind of features of the environment in which this is operating. So people in that circumstance may well not, if left to their own devices, have ever conceived of the idea of sexually abusing a child. But being in a situation where other people were doing it and getting away with it, and maybe being part of the cover-up, may have drawn them in. And social situations can also induce emotional arousal in a variety of ways that might provoke a criminal response. And that's another interesting aspect, I think, about sexual abuse, that so often sexual abuse seems to involve what I think is a kind of a conflation of nurturing and caregiving motivations with sexual motivations. That particular configuration of basic human motivations is actually commonplace, and we've probably all experienced it in our own adult relationships, where caring to a partner who is in need arouses emotional intimacy and often brings people into physical touch, and that touch might arouse sexual feelings, and there may even be a sexual encounter that follows from that. And so long as that's all protected with clear agreements about consent and everybody's happy with it, then there's no problem with that. It's really commonplace. The problem, of course, is that if that happens in relation to a child, we've got a whole lot of problems that follow from that. Thus, some situations can precipitate abuse-related motivations that would not otherwise occur, at least not at that specific time or place. And I think, coming back to the idea of near causes, it is ultimately specific incidents that we're wanting not to happen. So if we can stop it at one time and place, we've got to win. Because I think from a victim's point of view, it's not going to matter much to them whether their abuser has done it 100 times before or whether it's the first time. It seems to me irrelevant. So let's try and I want to talk a little bit about another typology here. Again, just trying to find some way to reduce the wide variation of circumstances in situations that might relate to sexual abuse particularly. So another hypothetical typology. Firstly, we might think about some situations as being highly challenging in the sense that there are already strong situational barriers. For example, there are restricted opportunities. Let's think about this in an organisational setting. The case study that I want to give very shortly is an example in an organisational setting. And I think organisational settings are exactly the best place to begin with situational prevention. And the reason is because organisations have potentially almost complete control over what happens in that organisation in ways that it's a bit harder to exercise that control in family settings. But we can do it in organisations. We could, I think, virtually eradicate sexual abuse in organisations by being clearer about how we might do that. So in these kinds of circumstances, and these really are the ones that we would want to create, we might even have another ideal level of situation where it's impossible, for abuse to occur, but I'm not sure that's anything but ideal or idealistic. So let's say that the best we can do really is to establish the most challenging environments possible. So if abuse is to occur in this kind of environment, it requires the abuser to actively manipulate that environment in order to circumvent those barriers. And that's very effortful. It requires the person to go to significant length in order to do that. It's also quite risky, of course, because if the protections are there in place, then the behaviours that are going to be needed to be involved to circumvent the barriers are going to create risk to the abuser as well. And if other people are aware of what maybe to look for, then the behaviour, even the preliminary kind of so-called grooming behaviour, might be detected and no abuse happens. Or if abuse does happen, sadly, at least there might be an opportunity to detect that early and not have the compounding effects of repeated abuse and secrecy and all the rest of it that goes with it. The second type of situation, just for the sake of the argument here, I'm just calling tempting situations. So here is, and again, if we think about an organisational environment, an opportunity for sexual contact fortuitously occurs. For example, an older person finds themselves alone with an attractive, in inverted commas, this is all a matter of perception, with a vulnerable child in the absence of a capable guardian. And thirdly, what I'm calling here a precipitating situation. This follows from the work on crime precipitators, the idea that environments can affect motivation, can cause, if you like, a motivation to occur at a particular moment that would not otherwise occur if that situation hadn't acted in that way. So here we've got the kind of circumstance where there's an unexpected or an unplanned set of circumstances that prompts sexual interest. Going back to this idea that sometimes I think this often does involve this curious conflation of it's so often seen where the prelude to the abuse involves the abuser revealing personal information to a child, a kind of a role reversal, using the child almost as the parent, or as the adult, oh, you really understand me, don't you? You know, I'm having a terrible time at home with my wife and she doesn't understand me anymore, but you understand me, don't you? You know, and sort of drawing the child in to that kind of special relationship, and then moving to some non-sexual touching, you know, which sparks maybe the interest further. I mean, some of this may even happen for the first-time abuser without them even being aware that it's sexual yet. It may become sexual later. For the practiced offender, it's probably much more conscious and deliberate, but for the first-time abuser, perhaps not. So, if we just remind ourselves of the kind of typology of the abuser that I was hypothesising, and then just a moment ago, the typology of situations, and this might help, I think, to think about then how these kinds of interactions work. There are two things, I think, that are important about this table. One of them is that as the strength of motivation, the strength of determination on the offender declines or increases, the importance of situations doesn't change. The situation is always important. What changes is the relationship between the motivation and the situation. The second point that I think this table illustrates is that there's a downward flow, but not an upward flow, of offenders across the situation types. So for a predatory offender, they're likely to be the only type of offender really that could operate or would operate within a highly challenging environment. But they will also be probably first to go, you know, in a situation where there's an opportunity that actually presents itself. So they're also likely to exploit circumstances. Which means that if you could create an organisational setting that makes it the most challenging, even for the predatory offenders, you're probably preventing a range of potential circumstances that might otherwise be acted upon. With respect to the other kinds of abusers, if you create that challenging environment, you can more or less eliminate those offences because, by definition, those offenders aren't going to want to go to the effort and take the kinds of risks. They're not as driven to get the outcome as the predatory offender might. Adam, do I have still 10 or 15 minutes, do you think? 10? Okay. So let me quickly then run through, just by way of summarising, how we might operationalise these concepts, and then I'll just very, very quickly move through a real case study. So these situational prevention principles have wide application, but the interventions need to be tailored to the specific problem at hand. It's really a local issue, and the more specific, the better. What might be useful to do in one organisational setting just might not make sense in the next. So the principles basically are increasing the effort. We're wanting to make the problem behaviour, and I'm defining that not just as the abuse behaviour, but that includes the prelude kind of behaviour, the things that may be detectable or that may be serving the purpose of creating the opportunity to abuse. So we want to make that problem behaviour more difficult and more inconvenient to enact. We want to increase the risk so as to make it more likely that the problem behaviour will be observed and detected. We want to control prompts. Now this is one of the technical terms in situational prevention. As if these ideas become more widely used in our efforts to prevent abuse, particularly in organisations, we might think about changing some of the language here, but this is just coming from situational crime prevention. But this is really about identifying and removing the triggers for abuse-related motivations. For example, you don't probably want a young male teacher alone to be in charge of a changing room full of 14-year-old girls, right? There's obvious potential there for motivations, sexual motivations to arise, whereas they might not have been there even on the walk over to the change room. And we want to reduce permissibility. This is especially important for those settings where there has become a kind of a corrupted culture, but it's important in any setting to make very clear right from the outset, to clarify expectations about behaviour, to personalise potential victims. Again, going back to Judge McClelland's comments about the circumstances in WA, we've heard so much over decades of horrendous abuse of children in institutions of all kinds, when the inmates, and really it's probably the right word for the circumstance, are dehumanised. You know, they don't have any value really as humans. They're to be used and exploited and so on. It's so much easier to hurt people when you think of them like that. So organisations have a responsibility to really clarify the values attached to the individuals involved. Okay, so very quickly. A few years ago, I was contacted by some lawyers. It's always interesting when the first contact is lawyers, to work with a private school, which I'm still under very strict advice not to identify, so I'm hoping that the detail won't identify it to anybody here. It was a church-affiliated school founded in the late 19th century, located in an inner-city suburb. There were about 1,200 boys in the school and ranging from preschool right through to the senior years on a single campus. And that's important because immediately I had the sense that the setting was going to be circumscribed. There's going to be a boundary around the setting. This is the place where we're going to have a bit of a think about what's going on. Over a period of 3 years, and this isn't very long ago, there were 3 arrests of staff at this school. Horrendous for the school. I mean, horrendous for a whole lot of other people too, but from the school's point of view, the reputational impact was enormous. And 2 of those were for possession of internet child pornography and hadn't apparently involved any actual abuse of children within the school setting. Although for one of those, one of the worries was that some of the images apparently involved boys at a previous school that he'd worked at and were kind of bondage videos, tying boys up. So clearly there were reasons for concern about the risks to actual children in the school. Anyway, before anybody knew about that, he was arrested. And then the third one involved, this is 1 year, then the next year, and then the next year. These people didn't even know one another. Well, the hands-on offender knew because he had been around for a long time. It was a very unusual situation because this young man who had been the offender in the third of these instances had been a pupil of the school himself as a child and had never ever actually quite left the school. Now, we see these little red flags from time to time, these curiosities of circumstance, and he had never got any professional qualifications. He did a certificate in first aid, and because of his commitment and special, we hear this word special relationship all the time, don't we? He had a special relationship with the school and was kept on by the school because they saw him as owing him some kind of duty to look after him as a former pupil. His job was to provide first aid to boys. He wasn't a qualified teacher. And over the course of several years ended up abusing something like 6 or 7 of these boys in the school. So I was engaged by lawyers, and one of the reasons why I think that's important is because my access actually to all of this was tightly controlled on this basis. I had a young lawyer sit in on all of my interviews with people in the school, for example, and so there were obviously concerns for them about potential litigation in the future and all these kinds of things. Very understandable. But just to say, I wasn't given free and open access to every piece of information. So they'd read about the situational prevention and were curious about it, and it wasn't for them just about protecting themselves. I absolutely had the idea that they were really genuine in wanting to do whatever they could to prevent any of these kinds of things happening in the future. The school's response to the incidents indicated to me there was no attempt for them to be minimising or covering up the problem, and they'd already taken significant measures just on the basis of common sense. I was almost going to have a subtitle for my talk, situational crime prevention, is it anything more than common sense? And I think this is part of a barrier for people to take it seriously, because a lot of common sense stuff can lead to useful interventions like this. I'm just going to check it again with you, Adam, about time, because if I need to maybe wrap up in a few minutes, I might. 5? Okay, I'll just speed through this. They'd already done some interesting things. For example, connected to their tradition was the idea that the pupils all had to come to school in their school dress uniform, and then on a sports day would go to a changing room, change into their sport gear, do their sport, come back to the change room, change back into their gear, and so on. And somebody at the school had recognised that, well, maybe we can just, do away with that tradition after 150 years or whatever it is, and allow the kids to come to school in their sports uniform. Just, it's a small thing, but, and I thought, gee, that's sensible, I mean, it's not a, and this is the way these things work. It has to happen in the context of how the school operates. And I was very clear at the beginning that I don't know how to run a school, so this is an exchange of ideas. It has to be worked out in that way. They also had new rules about cameras. I think because of the significance of the pornography offences that they'd been confronted with, they realised that it might not be a good idea for teachers or other people to be able to bring their own cameras to the school. So they would have school-issued cameras that we used. So that just became a rule, didn't really bother anybody. So many of these things can just be unobtrusive and simple and cheap to do. And none of them will solve the whole problem. It's just a lot of small things, really, that attend to the detail is the lesson. And they'd also done a lot of work in installing glass panels to make observation points into rooms. They already had a rule for a long time that an individual teacher isn't allowed to be in a room alone with a student. But of course, if you don't have a way of being able to observe that, then the rule doesn't amount to much when you can secrete yourself. The rule is helped along by having the ability to detect its violation. So I'm just going to skip a little bit. I'm just going to move quickly through some basic situational prevention techniques, linking them to the principles, and talking a little bit about what the school had already done and what I thought might be helpful additional things to do. They already had a system of working with children checks. They already had some system of reference checks, which we talked through in ways that might be improved. The first of the two pornography offenders had just come from a different school, so maybe there were opportunities there to talk a little bit more about the circumstances of their departure, etc. You never know what might turn up. And also I think a responsibility, a recognition, if we think about the role of situations in the way of how situations can prompt behaviours, one of the things that seems to happen for some sexual abusers is that the first incident occurs at a time where they're emotionally vulnerable themselves. Again, I'm not saying this to draw your sympathy to them, it's just a matter of fact. This is part of what happens with that kind of conversation that I was describing before about my wife doesn't understand me anymore, and you really do, don't you? And you're such a lovely girl. Well, that sort of stuff sometimes, that isn't necessarily the way that person would behave, in a dispositional sense, but it can be a situational set of incidents. So just keeping an eye out for staff who are in those kinds of circumstances, just checking to make sure if somebody is going through one of those kind of situations, you just help them out a bit and try and solve that before they go and try and solve it themselves with one of the kids. There's a couple of points here I wanted to talk about, but I won't have time. I mentioned observation panels before, that they were a kind of a common sense thing that the school had done, but one of the things I noticed was that a whole lot of them were covered up with posters and notices. Yeah. Now, I reckon nobody had done that so as to create the opportunity. It was a convenient place to put notices and posters. And so we had this conversation that I was suggesting that, look, rather than just issue some kind of stern rule, take all the notices and posters off the wall, buy little $5 corkboards and put them next to the windows so that people have an even more convenient place to put the notices, and then issue the rule. And that's a principle in situational prevention called facilitating compliance. What you want to do is to make the desired behaviour the easiest thing and the undesired behaviour the most difficult thing to do. So that, again, another revelation for them. Doesn't cost them anything at all, really much, in the scheme of things. And there are also some interesting places where they'd decided that they couldn't have observation panels. Well, we can't have an observation panel in the counsellor's room, because that's all private. And we can't have it in the chaplain's room because, you know, that's private. You know, it's a special case. The chaplain is a special case. So we've got to have the conversation about exactly that it was a special case, and that might be the very reason that they might want to kind of think about opening that up a little bit more. And not just with the glass panels, but, you know, it's important to think about routine movements of people. These places were down the end of corridors where nobody else went past as well, you know. And oddly, the places where they were still the most difficult places to observe were the very places, as it turned out, that abuse incidents had occurred. Isn't that interesting? That one of the places was at an oval, so mostly the school was set up very well, so routine movements of adults through the school on a day-to-day basis gave line of sight to just virtually everywhere. But there were a couple of blind spots, and one of them was at an oval away from the main school buildings, down a corridor into this first aid room or dressing room for the sports, you know, field, where most of the abuse had occurred, and nobody had yet paid attention to maybe changing the way that place was monitored, or whether you needed windows there or whatever it might be. The other place was a first aid room where a lot of the abuse had occurred too, and they thought that was another private space where you wouldn't have windows. Look, I think for time, let me just put these up anyway, and I'm very happy for these slides to be distributed if people think that's helpful. And I'm sorry that I kind of did run out of time, but I think I will leave it there. Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks a lot.